Power is a heavy burden that can break even the strongest of kings when they lose their way. Witness the rise and fall of empires and the lessons learned from the ruins of a broken crown. Subscribe today for the most epic tales of power and loss.
They never thought the man they looked down on would become the reason I survived the worst years of my life. My father, Dr. Raymond Ashford, is a cardiothoracic surgeon at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Fourth-generation physician. His grandfather built the first private clinic in Nashville in 1931. His father was chief of staff at 3 hospitals before he retired. My mother, Dr. Patricia Ashford, ran a dermatology practice so successful she was featured in Nashville Lifestyles magazine twice. I grew up knowing the weight of that name before I could even spell it. I was supposed to continue the legacy. That was never a question. It was just a fact, the way gravity is a fact. I met Daniel Kowalski at a 4th of July cookout my roommate dragged me to the summer before my junior year at Vanderbilt. He was standing near the grill, a little off to the side, wearing a faded green t-shirt and laughing at something the guy next to him said. Nothing about him announced himself. That was the first thing I noticed. Everyone else at that party was performing something. The right laugh, the right shoes, the right amount of casual confidence. Daniel was just standing there, actually relaxed. He asked me if I wanted the last hot dog with the kind of directness that caught me off guard. I said yes. We talked for 4 hours. He told me he was a carpenter. Custom furniture, renovation work, some cabinet installations on the side. He'd gone to a trade school in Murfreesboro instead of college. His dad had been a carpenter before him, and he made it sound like the most natural thing in the world. I didn't think anything of it that night. I just knew I wanted to talk to him again. We dated quietly for almost 5 months before I told my parents. I knew what I was doing by waiting. I was storing up enough of him, enough of us, to withstand what was coming. Every Sunday dinner, I sat across from my father, while he talked about colleagues and grants and the new cardiac wing, and I smiled and nodded and thought about the way Daniel had spent an entire Saturday building a bookshelf with me in his garage, teaching me how to measure twice and cut once. Both of us covered in sawdust by noon. I told them on a Thursday night in November. My mother had made her good pot roast. I thought maybe the food would help. It didn't. My father put his fork down. He looked at me the way he looked at a chart with numbers that didn't make sense. My mother asked me to repeat what I'd said. When I did, she set her wine glass down very carefully, like she was afraid of what she might do if she wasn't deliberate about that one small action. My father said, "A carpenter." Not a question, just the word, sitting there on the table between us like something he didn't want to touch. I said yes. I told them Daniel was kind, that he was smart, that he ran his own business and took real pride in his work. My father let me finish. Then he said that he hadn't spent 30 years building a reputation, so that his daughter could attach the Ashford name to a man who worked with his hands for a living. He said it without cruelty, which almost made it worse. He said it the way he might explain a medical diagnosis. This is the situation. These are the facts. My mother said, "Sweetheart, you're 22. You're going to meet so many people." I told them Daniel wasn't a phase. My father said, "Then we have a problem." I went home to my apartment that night and called Daniel. I told him everything. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Do you want me to come over?" I said yes. He drove 40 minutes at 11 o'clock on a Thursday to sit on my couch and let me be upset without trying to fix it. He didn't say anything bad about my parents. He just kept his hand on my back and let me talk until I ran out of words. That was the man they decided wasn't good enough. The next 6 weeks were a slow erosion. My mother called every few days, always with the same gentle pressure. My father stopped calling entirely, which was somehow louder. Then came Christmas. My mother left a voicemail saying they hoped I'd come home, but that they expected me to use good judgment about my situation before I did. I spent Christmas Eve with Daniel's family in a small house in Antioch. His mother made pierogi from scratch. His dad shook my hand and told me Daniel had talked about me so much, he felt like he already knew me. 3 of Daniel's sisters crowded into the kitchen after dinner and made me teach them a card game I only half remembered from college. I cried on the drive home. Daniel thought it was because I missed my parents. I let him think that. The truth was I was crying because I hadn't known it was possible to feel that welcome somewhere. January. My father called. I thought for one weightless second that something had shifted. Instead, he told me he'd spoken to a colleague whose son was finishing his residency at Johns Hopkins. He wanted to set up a dinner. I said no. He said he was asking me to be reasonable. I said I was in a relationship. He said, with a Carpenter, Lydia, be serious. I told him I was completely serious. He told me that if I intended to continue embarrassing the family, I should think very carefully about whether I expected their support going forward. I was 22 years old. I was in my second semester of junior year. I had $12,000 in my own savings account and a lease that ended in May. I told him I understood. He said, good. I said, I'm not ending things with Daniel. There was a long silence. Then he said, then I suppose we understand each other. He hung up. My mother sent a text 3 hours later that said only, I hope you know what you're doing. They stopped paying my tuition the following week. Not immediately. It took about 10 days for the financial hold to show up on my account, which tells you something about how deliberate it was. They didn't cut me off in a moment of anger. They did it after they thought it through. I sat in my car in the Vanderbilt parking garage for a long time, staring at that notification on my laptop screen. Then I called Daniel. He came. He always came. We sat in my car for 2 hours going through my options. I had enough savings for 1 semester if I was very careful. I could apply for financial aid, but the process would take time. Daniel had some money set aside. He offered it immediately and I told him I couldn't take it. He said, it's not charity, it's practical. I said I wasn't ready for that. He nodded and didn't push. I applied for every scholarship I could find that accepted mid-year applications. I picked up a job at a coffee shop near campus. I ate a lot of rice and eggs and called my grandmother on my dad's side sometimes, who was 79 and sharp as a tack, and who had never entirely agreed with how her son ran his household. She never gave me money. But she'd listen, and sometimes that was enough. I finished junior year. I finished senior year. I graduated with a degree in public health, a GPA I was proud of, and approximately $400 in my checking account. Daniel was in the 3rd row. He wore the only dress shirt he owned, and he stood up when I crossed the stage even though no one else in his section was standing yet. I saw him before I saw anyone else. We got married the following spring. City Hall, a Tuesday afternoon, his sister as witness, and my college roommate as mine. Afterward, we went to a Thai restaurant we liked and split the green curry and the drunken noodles, and a piece of mango sticky rice. Because we both wanted dessert, but only wanted to pay for one. It was the best meal I've ever had. My mother sent a card. It arrived 4 days after the wedding. It said wishing you happiness in her handwriting and nothing else. My father sent nothing. The years after that were not easy, and they were not pretty, but they were ours. Daniel's business grew steadily. He'd always been good. But around year 3 something clicked, and he started getting referrals from interior designers and contractors on bigger projects, custom built-ins, high-end kitchen renovations. One extraordinary commission to build an entire library for a house in Belmead that took him 4 months and ended up in an architecture magazine. I worked my way into a position at a nonprofit focused on maternal health in underserved communities. Not glamorous, not a medical dynasty, meaningful in a way I could feel every single day. We bought a house. Not big, not fancy. A 1940s bungalow in East Nashville with a porch that needed work and a backyard that needed more. Daniel rebuilt the porch himself that first summer. I painted it gray. We argued about the trim color for 3 weeks and landed on white, and it looked exactly right. Our daughter, Marin, was born 4 years after the wedding. She came into the world at 6:43 in the morning, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces. And she had Daniel's dark eyes and my stubborn mouth. And I have never been so certain of anything in my life as I was in that first hour. My parents did not come. I hadn't told them I was pregnant. I hadn't spoken to my father in over 2 years by then. My mother and I had a fragile, occasional contact. A birthday text here. A brief call at Thanksgiving that we both treated like walking across ice. I had told her about Marin a few weeks before the due date. She said, "Oh, Lydia." The way she said it, I couldn't tell if it was tenderness or sadness or both. She didn't ask if she could visit. Marin grew up. She was funny and stubborn and curious about everything. She went through a phase at 4 where she only wanted to wear her father's work gloves. She would follow him around his workshop on weekends, asking questions he answered with full seriousness, handing her real tools at ages most parents would consider insane, teaching her to sand with the grain, explaining why a dovetail joint holds better than a butt joint, and what that means for the life of a piece of furniture. She absorbed everything. At 6, she told her preschool teacher her dad makes things that last forever. I have that in a little note her teacher sent home. I've moved it between every bag I've owned since. My mother called on a Wednesday. Marin was 7. I was sitting in my car outside a community health clinic where I'd just spent 4 hours helping coordinate a grant proposal. It was nearly dark. I almost let it go to voicemail. My mother's voice was different. Thinner somehow. She said she was calling because she needed to tell me something. She said my father had been diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease 8 months ago. She said things had been progressing faster than the doctors initially expected. She said she was sorry she hadn't called sooner. She said, "I didn't know how to." I sat with that for a moment. 8 months. He'd known for 8 months and no one had told me. I asked how he was doing. She said he was managing, but that some days were harder. She said the reason she was calling now, the specific reason, was that my father's neurologist had suggested he start considering advanced care planning. And there were some financial questions related to long-term care that were becoming complicated. She was calling because they needed help navigating some of it. She didn't say it directly at first. She circled it, but by the end of the call it was clear. My father's disability coverage had a gap. The medications were expensive. And they were asking if I could help them figure out what resources were available. I'm a public health professional. I know how to navigate healthcare systems. That's exactly why she was calling. I told her I needed a few days to think. I told Daniel that night after Marin was asleep. He listened the way he always listened, which meant he didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "What do you want to do? Not what should we do? Not what are you going to do? What do you want?" He always asked the right question. I said I didn't know yet. I spent 3 days in that not knowing. I went to work, I made dinner, I helped Marin with her reading, and underneath all of it I turned the question over and over. My father, who had hung up the phone on me at 22 and let a financial hold appear on my tuition account and not sent a card when I got married, and never met my daughter. My father, who had a degenerative neurological disease and was scared, whether he would ever say so or not. My mother came to our house on a Saturday morning. I had told her she could. She stood on the porch Daniel had rebuilt and looked at the gray boards and the white trim and she said, "This is lovely, Lydia." Like she was surprised. Like she hadn't expected us to have something lovely. She had aged. I don't know why that surprised me too. 7 years is a long time. She was smaller than I remembered. Or maybe just softer. She sat at my kitchen table and I make coffee, and Marin came downstairs and looked at her with open curiosity. My mother looked at Marin like someone who just remembered they were hungry. I introduced them. Marin shook her hand very seriously and then asked if she wanted to see the thing her dad was building in the garage. My mother said yes. We spent 20 minutes in Daniel's workshop while Marin explained, incorrectly but confidently, the purpose of several tools. Daniel shook my mother's hand. He was polite, warm, easy. He held no visible grudge. I don't know how he does that. I never have. Afterward, while Marin was upstairs, my mother and I sat at the table again. She told me more about my father's condition. She told me about the medication costs, about the care coordinator they'd consulted, about the questions she didn't know how to answer. I asked her what they specifically needed from me. She said guidance, mostly. Information. Maybe help making some calls. She did not apologize. Not that morning. She started to once. She said, "I know things were difficult between us." And I let the silence sit long enough that she heard it. She nodded. She said, "I'm sorry for more than I know how to say right now." It wasn't enough, and we both knew it. And I think knowing that she knew it was something. I helped them. Not with money. I spent 6 hours over 2 weeks making calls, reviewing documentation, connecting them with a patient advocate who specialized in neurological disease care planning. I wrote up a clear summary of their options. I did it because my father is sick, and I am his daughter. And those two facts are both true at the same time as everything else that is also true. He did not call to thank me. My mother did. Twice. The second time she asked if she could see Marin again. I said I needed to think about it. There is a version of this story that ends with a grand reconciliation. A scene where my father sits on our porch and watches his granddaughter and understands everything he gave up. I have thought about that scene. I won't tell you I don't want it. Because some part of me does. The part of me that is still 22 years old, sitting in a parking garage, staring at a financial hold, wishing my parents were different people. But I'm 34 now. I've built a life that doesn't need their approval to be real. My daughter is being raised by a father who shows her every day that the work you do with your hands is something to be proud of, that skill and patience and care are not lesser virtues than prestige, that a dovetail joint outlasts a shortcut every time. She will grow up knowing her worth is not conditional. That is not something my parents gave me. I found it in a man in a faded green t-shirt at a 4th of July cookout who asked me if I wanted the last hot dog and meant it simply, without agenda, without performance. My mother came back in March. She brought Marin a book about animals, one of those big illustrated ones. Marin sat next to her on the couch and they went through it together. Marin narrating loudly and incorrectly about every species. My mother laughing in a way I hadn't heard since I was small. I stood in the doorway of my own living room and watched my daughter teach my mother how to be a grandmother, and I felt something complicated and quiet shift somewhere inside me. I don't know what my father and I will become. I don't know if he has enough time or enough willingness to close the distance. I know he's sick. I know he's proud. I know those two things may end up being bigger than whatever else could have existed between us. What I know for certain is this. Daniel is in the garage right now finishing a commission, a dining table for a family in Green Hills who will sit around it for decades without ever knowing the name of the man who built it. Marin is at school. The house is quiet in the good way. Tonight we'll have dinner, the three of us. And she'll tell us something she learned today with total authority, and Daniel will listen like it's the most important thing he's heard. And I will look across the table at the life we made from nothing but stubbornness and love, and think, as I have thought 10,000 times, that my parents were wrong. Not about everything, but about what matters. They were wrong about what lasts. I used to think the hardest part was the moment my father hung up the phone. That clean, final click. But looking back now, the hardest part was the years right after. The ones where I had to keep choosing the life I'd picked, even when it was uncomfortable and tight and uncertain. Choosing it on the days when the rice and eggs got old. Choosing it when I saw someone from my parents' world at a conference and had to decide in real time whether to explain myself or just smile and move on. That's where character actually gets built, not in the dramatic moments, in the quiet, repetitive ones where you just keep going anyway. What I understand now that I didn't at 22 is that my parents were evil people. They were people who had organized their entire sense of safety around a certain kind of life, and I had walked away from it. That terrified them in a way they never had the language to express, so it came out as control, as ultimatums, as silence. That doesn't make what they did right, but understanding it helped me stop waiting for an apology that was going to arrive in pieces, if at all, rather than all at once, the way I'd imagined it. Daniel never once asked me to forgive them faster than I was ready to. He never pushed me toward reconciliation as some kind of proof that I was a good person. He understood, the way people who are genuinely secure in themselves tend to understand, that my healing wasn't a performance for anyone else's comfort, that steadiness in him, year after year, is what made it possible for me to eventually open the door when my mother knocked. Not because I owed it to her, because I was ready. There's a real difference between those two things. Marin is the living proof of everything my parents got wrong. She is being raised in a house where the person who builds things with his hands is the person who is most respected, where patience is treated as a skill, where doing something well and doing something for status are understood to be completely different goals. She is 7 years old, and she already knows the difference. I didn't learn that until I was in my 30s. There is a version of the woman I would have become if I had listened to my parents. I think about her sometimes. She would have the right last name next to the right credentials. She would know how to move through rooms that impress people. She would be safe in all the ways my parents understood safety to mean. And she would be building her life on someone else's definition of what her life was supposed to look like. I chose the harder thing, and the harder thing turned out to be the real thing. Whatever comes next with my father, whether there is time and willingness enough to build something new, or whether the distance becomes permanent, I am not afraid of the answer. I know who I am. I know what I built. And I know that the man who asked me if I wanted the last hot dog on a summer evening and meant it simply, without agenda, was the best decision I ever made. Some things you only understand by living them all the way through.